Katie, thank you so much for being here today on Like Therapy.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes, we're excited to have you. Reading through your bio, you're a specialist in radically open DBT, exposure response prevention therapy, somatic therapy, and brain spotting, which are all very specialized and unique trainings to really personalize therapy to what people need. And I want to focus on one today because I think it's really fascinating and not a lot of people know about it. So let's talk today about RODBT.
Let's
What
do
do
it.
you think?
Let's do it.
Okay, so first, I think it's interesting for two reasons. One, because of what it targets, like what types of things it's helpful for. Because I don't think there's a lot of other therapies out there that really specialize in this or target this, and also just how it kind of blends both our mind and our body in different ways. So tell me, what do you like about it? What do you think is so unique about radically open DBT?
Yeah. Maybe I'll start off by talking a little bit about kind of what it is.
Yes.
So RODBT is a newer evidence-based treatment designed for what they would call disorders of emotional over control. Essentially, what that means is people who tend to inhibit rather than express their emotions. That might be how we generally might define emotionally over controlled. But it's a set of traits that society usually deems as really good things and reinforces. Things like following the rules, things like being able to not necessarily immediately say what comes to your mind, things like being structured and organized and methodical. These are all traits that our society reinforces and admires typically. But what we know is that historically, psychological treatments and psychology in general has kind of thought that there was this relationship between psychological health and emotional control was a more is better kind of thing. So kind of the more emotional control you have, the greater your psychological health. What we've come to realize and what RODBT really I think kind of acknowledges is that it's not a more is better kind of thing. It's more like a bell curve where we see problems associated with too much or too little emotional control. So people that are maybe too expressive or struggle to manage really intense emotions, think like kind of the standard DBT of Marshall Linehan in the 90s. RODBT looks at the problems and targets the problems that are associated with excessive inhibitory control. So people that tend to be too structured, too rule bound, excessively tend to like mask or hide their emotions. These lead to problems with social connectedness, with openness, and with flexibility, all of which make it challenging to navigate the world, or can make it challenging to navigate the world effectively. So RODBT, in a nutshell, kind of targets those things, and that's kind of the basis for RODBT.
And I like how you mentioned how society responds and reinforces, because I think it can be so hard for someone to even explain, like, this is what I'm struggling with, this is what I'm feeling, this is what's happening to me, when outwardly, I'm organized and I have great grades and job's going great, and other people might not even know that anything's wrong because I always seem fine, or I'm fitting into this identity that is productive or societally reinforced. So I think it's helpful, the way you explained that, and the way that like it might be a struggle to even name, but I still feel this pain.
Absolutely. And a lot of people that come to RODBT have been through other types of treatment before, relatively maybe unsuccessfully or partially successfully. And they're kind of sometimes the suffer in silence crowd again, because they're getting a lot of reinforcement externally. They are typically quite successful in their jobs. They, I kind of think of it as like the look good on paper sort of thing, but often feel like something's missing from their lives, often feel quite emotionally lonely. That's a phrase that we often use a lot in Radically Open DBT, is this sense of not really feeling very deeply connected to others.
Yeah.
And importantly, that doesn't necessarily mean a lack of contact with people. There are a lot of over-controlled individuals who can have a lot of friends, seemingly, but there's a feeling of disconnection, or maybe not necessarily, maybe kind of like a lack of depth to those relationships, or a lack of emotional intimacy to those relationships, which then kind of creates that disconnect of, I might have lots of connections, but or lots of contact, but the depth of those connections leads to a sense that something's kind of missing, which we often know lack of social connectedness is correlated with things like anxiety, depression, these kinds of things. Many other issues too.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's something that so many people struggle with. And again, it's like they can even feel like a shame or confusion in trying to describe it, because again, it looks good on paper. Like they'll say, I feel like I don't have any friends, and also, I'm going to a birthday party later, so I don't know how to describe what's missing. So this is just, I think, one of the coolest things about RODBT is that the language is so specific, so helpful. I was reading through the workbook when I was preparing for our conversation today, and I think that's I love several things about it, but one of the things I love about it is it succinctly describes these things, and in this way that's so direct that it's just shame resilience. You know what I mean? Like you read it and you're like, oh, this is on paper. This is, here are like examples of what this might feel like. And then, of course, since it's a workbook, it has some really tangible things to do next. But I don't know, it struck me of like these things might be really hard to describe because of the shame or embarrassment I think that's sometimes associated. And I just think the book is, and that's, I think, inherent in the therapy itself too. And you can tell me more about that, but I think there's a directness and a compassion in the therapy. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, and one of the ROisms, I guess, that I might call it, is kindness first and foremost. So a lot of people who are emotionally over-controlled have traits of perfectionism, which often includes a really harsh inner critic, and people who care about doing things well, following the rules, who might be not very flexible or not very open, tend to have harsh inner critics. And so kindness first and foremost is both the way that we try to approach RO with clients, and a way that we encourage, clients and people who are doing RO to interact with others and to kind of think about themselves is with a lot of kindness. And I agree with you. I think that the way that RO presents education on over control and the skills that help people with excessive over control is done in a very matter-of-fact way, with a lot of kindness, that this is not necessarily something that we want to think of as inherently or automatically bad, because oftentimes the traits of over control are the reason people who are coming for RO have been successful in their lives. So it's important to give credit to that, and to not necessarily criticize or pathologize that part but also to begin to consider, where has this maybe been too much of a good thing?
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
doing that in a very compassionate and direct and matter of fact way just makes it like, yeah, this is something that we're doing together.
Yeah. Yeah. And you don't have to necessarily, define really any of it as good or bad. It's just, here's how we can find some balance. Let's talk more about that, because I think people often wonder, like, okay, great, this all sounds good, but what actually happens when I give up my productivity, perfectionism, self-critic? Like, yeah, I don't want the self-critic, and also the self-critic is what I rely on. So tell me more about, I think different therapy modalities do different things, and this one is so interesting with the kindness first and foremost. I think that scares people.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in terms of, so tell me your question again.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm understanding how to.
Yeah. No, I'm glad. Okay, so and you can tell me if these are sort of two different things or not, but what it makes me think of is that not only is there this approach of kindness first and foremost, I think sometimes that can sound scary, because it's like, okay, but hold on, that sounds nice, but the thing that has made me successful is not kindness. It's been being hard on myself. It's been being productive first and foremost. And so I think there's this idea of like, what does that even look like? Like, how do I do that while still being able to feel successful or be successful? Am I replacing the self-critic with kindness? What does that relationship look like?
Yeah. I think that oftentimes, like, there's a lot of myths, or over-controlled myths about different things, and so actually in the RODBT workbook, there's different sections that's over-controlled myths about relationships, about emotions, things like that. I think with like the inner critic, what is perhaps a stance that, or something that we might consider is, is it possible that this idea that my inner critic is the thing that helps me is maybe a myth?
Yeah.
Or is it possible that there are other aspects of myself, and traits that I possess, being hardworking, the aspects of my over control, like following the rules, being structured, that all of those are things that, yes, have helped me to be successful, not necessarily the critical part in and of itself. I think that can be kind of a myth of over control, of perfectionism, that if I let go of this sort of crack the whip habit that I have with myself, that everything's going to crumble. And with RO, there's a practice called self-inquiry that is about kind of being curious about kind of how and why we think and respond in certain ways. That's kind of in a nutshell. I can talk more about that later. Yeah. But then there's also this practice of doing new things without necessarily always thinking 5 steps ahead or 4, 3 steps ahead or whatever, which is very much something that people who are over controlled tend to do. It's like, I only do things or try new things if I'm relatively certain of the outcome. Yeah. And so part of what we are encouraging people to practice in RO is, how can I embrace a bit of uncertainty and not necessarily trying to curate the outcome of what I'm going to do, but trying something and seeing what happens. That kind of cultivating a sense of spontaneity is an important skill, and one that's quite challenging for a lot of over-controlled people.
Yeah. Like finding that value in trying something in a new way, letting go of the outcome, and that even just that ability to sort of expand within yourself, or even just kind of at the beginning just tolerate what that actually feels like, you know, is deeply important.
Yeah, one of my favorite things that Tom Lynch said when I was going through one of the trainings was this discomfort that people feel is that oftentimes when people come to therapy, they're doing so because they're uncomfortable. And so, for example, say with trying something new,
Yeah.
so they're already uncomfortable. So there's the discomfort of staying the same, and then there's this discomfort of trying something new. And this little kind of quippy way he had in the training was like, basically just like, how do you want to be uncomfortable? And I think that that's also part of this thing that we were working on in RO is about tolerating discomfort
Yeah.
as well, because a lot of times people who are over controlled, they're really good at problem solving, they're really good at structuring or doing life in a way that minimizes discomfort. And so partly we want to look at what are the ways in which that, is helpful and works, and then what are the ways in which that limits you, either in, the person that you want to be, the values you want to live by, your relationships, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And even that distinction of, how, when you're doing it and you have that moment, what does it actually feel like when it's helpful discomfort versus unhelpful discomfort? Because I think sometimes it does just become, it's like this split second cognition of, oh, I'm in discomfort, so that's bad, I need to get out. And so then as people are practicing this, there's that sense of, what does it actually feel like when I'm in discomfort that's helpful? And they can kind of feel into that in their body and their emotions, and maybe even stay out of cognition, maybe.
I do think that there's something to that, like that there's the people who tend to be over controlled are very cognitive, and not necessarily completely disconnected from how they feel sort of from the neck down, but there is a bit of, when we're talking about over control, it's people who tend to kind of push through discomfort,
Yes.
and do it without really making a big deal out of it.
Yeah.
And so it is kind of building building awareness and curiosity about, like, what is going on with me when, right before I have the urge to fix something, whether it's a grammar error or a crooked, picture frame on the wall or something like that, or before I maybe correct a friend about something that doesn't necessarily need to be corrected.
Yeah.
That these are things that can kind of, or I guess these little fixing habits can kind of keep people stuck in that kind of over-controlled, these over-controlled habits, because, okay, I fixed the grammar error, I get a momentary like, oh, that feels amazing that I fixed this error and I caught it, and that reinforces over-control. And so that over control is very much thought of from an RO standpoint as a habit. That, sometimes it's over controlled habits are things that we might do intentionally, but they also could be things that are just very much habitual, and that force of habit. And so building awareness of, what's happening, what are my habits and what happens when I'm about to engage in them.
Like the habits, and then just what we know about how the brain just loves familiarity and efficiency. So our brains just love those neural pathways that they just can go to every time.
And OC individuals love familiarity and consistency too.
I mean, that makes sense.
Everybody does.
But I mean, even if you think about like yeah, like why the brain likes it. I mean, it's efficient, it's productive, it's, Um, okay, so let's talk more about that moment. When you're trying to explore this, you're trying to figure this out. Um, Sometimes, and I think this is with any type of therapy, but it's like we're so used to using our brains that we can get kind of caught up in the thoughts. So RO talks a lot about how you can sort of address your body first in order to disrupt some of these habits, or kind of our brains wanting to do this thing. And so you're talking about sort of that moment. Can you talk more about how maybe you can notice, like, oh, I think everything's fine, but actually, my jaw is tense and I'm like not really breathing that much, and or how you can start with your body in order to, whether it's figure out what you're feeling, or maybe even in a moment like that just figure out, like, oh well, even if I'm feeling like I'm about to get that reward, that little, maybe I'm actually not because I'm tense, or say more about how RO thinks about that.
Yeah, so one of the first lessons, I believe it's lesson 3, when we teach the RODBT skills class,
Yeah.
is on the neuroregulatory model of emotions.
I love that chart. Okay, that chart is the best. So please talk about the chart too.
I think it's really helpful because I think for people in general who are curious about and wanting to learn about how their brains and bodies work, I think it is super helpful. And people who are over controlled are usually the people that are really curious and eager to learn and understand and know things. They want to know how things work, and so the neuroregulatory model of emotions is connected to, or kind of based off of Porges' polyvagal theory, which and so briefly, RODBT talks about 5 categories of emotion that the brain is hardwired to respond to. So we are hardwired to respond to safety cues, so things that cause us to feel calm, relaxed, and safe. Novelty cues, which is sort of like our evaluative process. So something unexpected happens. It's sort of like your ears perk up, your attention goes to the unexpected thing that happened to determine, is this thing good or bad, relative, relevant to my safety kind of thing. We're hardwired to respond to threatening cues. This is the fight flight thing that we are often talking about more and more with clients in therapy, and I think as a society we're talking about more and more about that. We're also hardwired, so the 4th cue is reward cues. So this is sort of like the excitement, goal pursuit, like reward anticipation feeling. So, like if I'm going to go to a Harry Styles concert, or I'm going to go to a Taylor Swift concert or something like that, the anticipation of that turns on the reward center of my brain. And the last one's overwhelm. And this is not necessarily like overwhelm in the way that we typically use the word. It's more of like our playing possum mode, which is the like emergency shutdown. So it's like if I've gotten too overwhelmed in fight or flight, my body starts to shut down and almost go into kind of numb, disconnected, maybe dissociative kind of mode to minimize pain until the threat has passed enough, or until I feel like some of those other methods of like fight or flight can be useful again. And so the reason we teach that is because it is really it's our process of safety, fight or flight, all of that. Like this is all survival. These are all kind of survival mechanisms, and they are oftentimes we go into them automatically. Like it's not necessarily like consciously I'm going, body, brain, turn on fight or flight. Like these are things that happen outside of our conscious awareness. But it's helpful to know, and this is part of why we teach it early on, where our brain and our body are when we're out living life. Am I in safety? Am I in threat? Am I in reward? Am I in overwhelm? Because these are going to substantially affect how we take in information, how we make sense of that information, how we engage in relationships, and importantly, because RO focuses so much individually on our social signaling habits, how we interact with others and how we socially signal, how we come across to people. So though that is kind of in a nutshell, not a large nutshell, I think, how RO, I guess, thinks about the neuroregulatory model of emotions.
Yeah. P.S. I noticed that we're both starting with the edges of the puzzle, and I don't know, like maybe that's just everybody does it, but I just was like, of course we're both starting with the edges, so I don't know.
It's probably my over control, actually. That's the way I believe that's the right way to do
like
things.
that, and so do I. I'm like, if you told me right now, if you were like, Rachel, forget the edges and do something else, I would like probably switch into a different
it would probably activate your threat system,
yes,
you might notice. And that's one thing that I would like to tack on to what I said, is that part of teaching people is both kind of what each of these emotion, like categories of emotion are, but also like how to recognize each one.
Yeah.
So how do you recognize and know when you're in a state of safety?
Yeah.
Recognize calm in your body, in how you think about things. How do you recognize fight or flight? How do you recognize reward, overwhelm? That then becomes kind of the departure point, I suppose, for looking at, or knowing what's happening then when I'm doing certain things.
Yeah, like I think I'm fine. If you asked me, I'd say I'm fine. But if I were to look at my body and know, like, okay, wait a second, I'm actually, I'm shaking my foot a little bit and I'm kind of breathing a little tighter. So maybe I don't even always know what that is. Maybe in the moment I can't remember the chart, but like there can be some recognition in me of like, oh wait, actually I might be feeling nervous instead of fine. Or the reward one is so interesting too when we're in relation with other people, because I think, your description of like, okay, when we're going to a concert, we're in reward. And it was so fascinating for me to learn that we can also be in reward when we think we're about to solve a problem, or, when we like if we're having a debate about something and maybe I'm like starting to get really engaged because I think like, oh, I'm about to be right about something, or like, oh, I'm about to solve this problem. And so then I might not even know that I'm like leaning in, that I'm getting animated. I'm in reward. Yes. And so sometimes it's helpful to know when we're in relation with other people, like, do they know we're in reward, or are they like, what just happened here, or even if you're, sometimes I like to use this chart about anger too. Like we all are in sometimes different columns. If we're angry but we think we're solving a problem, or if we're angry but we're actually scared, or like it can help to even see the different ways that emotions kind of affect us and what mode our brain and body and nervous system is actually clicking into. And then we can say like, oh, wait, I actually think I might be, judging by my body and why I'm continuing this argument, even though I'm kind of fine with it. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm actually in reward, or, anything like that. It helps us not only name emotions, but it helps us name like how we experience the emotion.
Yes.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes. And I would take, for RODBT, I would take it a step further and go to how that gets expressed. One of the things that I would hope to your listeners to know
Yeah.
after listening to this is that in individual RODBT, one of the main focuses is on social signaling.
Yes, tell us about
So,
that. Like, what does that mean? And
so people who are over-controlled, and when we talk about over-control, I named some of the traits, but diagnoses that might fall into that category could be things like obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, importantly distinguished from obsessive-compulsive disorder, avoidant personality disorder, things like persistent or refractory depression and anxiety, eating disorders like anorexia, even autism spectrum disorders can kind of fall into that, like over-controlled coping, and these are these are people who are what we call hyper-threat sensitive. So they are more likely to experience stimuli externally, internally as bad or negative, and they've also learned and in some ways are their temperament, their biotemperament is designed to be over controlled or is over controlled. And so the combination of the hyper threat sensitivity plus the things that over controlled people kind of learn throughout their lives, which is the over controlled coping getting reinforced, is that they're people who, tend to not take risks, they tend to mask their emotions, and they tend to be really slow to warm up to new people. Or have that difficulty that we talked about earlier with establishing those kind of deeper and more meaningful connections because they tend to mask or hide emotions. And what we know from that is that humans are tribal creatures. We are designed to be in relationship with others, and so many of our emotions have evolved, namely self-conscious emotions, to protect, the interests of a group over an individual. But what was important in terms of the development of that kind of tribalism in early humans, so I think of people who were living in caves and things like that, is the ability to quickly and effectively exchange information. And how we did learn to do that was through social signaling mechanisms and capabilities. So think not just verbal but nonverbal, I'm going to think of you as a much safer person if you are sitting back, relaxed, with a smile and a soft expression on your face, than if you were standing up, over me with your arms crossed and a frown on your face. And so we learned these complex social signaling capabilities as a way to communicate effectively. We know is that people who are over controlled is based on this tendency to be hyper threat sensitive and to inhibit emotional expression, is that affects their social signaling abilities, their ability to convey in a way that the other person is going to interpret the message that the over controlled person wants to send. And so we're often looking and focusing in RO on, what are the social signaling habits that you've developed that maybe are not working for you across a variety of situations that may be causing conflict or difficulty in your relationships. And we focus on those things really with the kind of primary goal of helping people who are over-controlled to establish greater vulnerability, intimacy, and social connectedness with the people that they want to in their lives.
Vulnerability, intimacy, and social connectedness.
Yes.
I mean, I feel like I just wanted to say those again out loud because how how central those are and how many people are just really trying to grow and learn in those areas and figure out how to explore that and grow. And I think I'm so glad you described all that, because that can be our social signals can just be another thing we're just not aware of because we learned them at some point. They protected us at some point, and we just don't know that that's what maybe is hindering us from some of those goals. And I wanted to even just say, even just now, like as we both just kind of, did it in the moment, what also happens is not only is like the signal changing, but our own nervous system or emotional, ID or whatever is changing. Like just now when I sit back, I also feel a different type of relaxation. I also, you know what I mean? Which I wouldn't necessarily have been able to think my way into.
Yeah.
So it's doing this double whammy. It's changing this external signal, but it's also changing this internal signal.
Yeah, and I think that there's the what we would call social safety activation skills,
Yes,
which is
tell us about those.
these are the things that we try to practice, say in an effort to if you're an over-controlled person who is hyper threat sensitive and feels a lot of anxiety a lot of time, social safety activation skills are practices to practice and do that help shift from that threat activation to more one of safety activation. So you mentioned the like leaning back in your chair, putting a soft expression on your face, maybe raising your eyebrows with a closed mouth cooperative smile. In RO, we would call that the big 3+1. A lot of the safety activation tools are what we might call like bottom-up regulation. So it is things that you do with your body, again, to try to create that shift from, perhaps threat, perhaps overwhelm to one of safety, or even sometimes like reward.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we underestimate, like we can see how, say in the case of social anxiety, somebody's excessive or significant anxiety in a social situation might cause them to show up in the social situation in a way that is, they might look like really kind of tense and constricted. They might have a flat affect, or they might have like a, like a painted on kind of smile that doesn't feel authentic and maybe doesn't communicate authenticity. And that again ends up, whether intentionally or not, being a social signal to the receiving group about like your intentions or your degree of genuineness and authenticity. And so we're, kind of going back to the safety activation skills, these are the things that we do more kind of individually to try to create more of a sense of safety. I think when we're able to, through practice again and again, socially signal around others in a way that matches our values rather than what matches like over-controlled habits or threat sensitivity or something like that, then, we begin to build relationships that are more trusting, and ultimately the relationship itself then creates that feeling of safety and security and connectedness and acceptance, which also causes that threat to go down, and we know also leads to improvements in symptoms of anxiety, depression, things like that. So the safety activation is more of that kind of individual thing, and then this, the social signaling is like how am I showing up in a way that builds connection with others that ultimately leads then to my relationships being a source of safety as well. And connectedness, acceptance, all of that.
Yeah. Can we do some of the social safety activations together?
Sure.
Now? I feel like I'll start. I can't remember if this is from RO or for a different modality of therapy, but one of my favorite ones to do, even in my practice, because I feel like it just accomplishes a couple of things, is breathing in through your nose and then breathing out hard. So, So is that from RO or is that from something else?
Breathing in general is, I'm trying to remember what's
that
all
might
listed
be from
there.
somatic, but so the actual, like, it's an instinctual thing that humans do. Like maybe everyone's probably can think of a time when they've just sort of done that when they're like, trying to, coming down off of something, but It kind of vibrates your face a little bit. It activates, oh, this must be from Essie. It activates the polyvagal nerve, and then it makes you laugh because you feel silly doing it. And so then there's this, right? Like there's that, it's this, a couple of different bottom up processing things going. And if we're doing it together and then we're both laughing, then I'm like, oh, okay, there's a social safety too. So tell me, what are the ROs? What are your favorites? Let's do a few.
So one of the ones that I almost always teach my clients is paced breathing, because it's something that you can do anywhere.
Yeah.
You can do it in the middle of the test. You can do it when you're recording a podcast. You can pace your breathing. Really, unless you're in the middle of talking, you can practice it. And so the one that is my go-to is box breathing, and many people have heard of this, where essentially you imagine a square, and each side of the square represents 4 seconds. So you would inhale as you count to 4, hold your breath in as you count to 4, exhale, count to 4, hold out, count to 4. You just repeat a few times, and that paced breathing helps to turn on the safety part of your brain. Where when we're in threat, our breathing tends to be fast and shallow and kind of irregular, and so by pacing it, we're intentionally doing something that mimics what we would normally do in a state of safety.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to practice that one together, or if I should just move on to describing some of my other favorites.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Okay. So, and I'll kind of draw out the visuals. So it would be up on the floor.
Yeah. Do you want me to just count you through it? Like
Yeah.
you can pretend that we're in therapy together,
Sure.
and I'll count you through it.
Okay.
And we'll do 2 rounds,
Okay.
and you can just do like a brief check of what you're feeling right now. And then exhale all your air. And then inhale, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Inhale, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. So,
I mean, you feel it instantly. And I love that word, because I feel like a lot of people hear deep breathing and they're like, okay, great. Like, and I just like that we're exploring like what it really can do, what different types of deep breathing can do. Like, it's not sort of a one size fits all. You can practice different ones and see what happens. Like, I immediately notice my shoulders dropping. Like, what else is happening in your body, even if maybe your thought is still, well, I still don't know what to do or whatever. Like, these are some steps that you can start to feel safe enough to even then go back into your brain. But yeah, tell me like one more that you like.
well, I would say that there are a couple. So one is I like a lot of body-based stuff. So stretching is one that I think can be really, really helpful, both for social safety activation, as well as building awareness of the body. You know, that when you are using your body and stretching, like, you're building awareness of like what's happening and what it feels like to stretch. So sometimes I'll teach clients like a short little like not really like yoga sequence necessarily, but just like a couple of poses from yoga, or if they're somebody who's done a lot of yoga, like, encourage them to, what are some of your favorite poses? Oftentimes, their favorite poses are going to be favorites for a reason. They feel good, right? And really, safety activation is about kind of creating that felt sense of safety and relaxation, and people can find lots of different ways of doing that and exploring that. But I really like stretching, and then the other one that I'll tack on is a progressive muscle relaxation.
Yeah.
But there are so many others too, like looking at pictures, petting a dog, hugging your cat, if they'll let you. Uh, imagining scenes from a place that makes you feel calm and happy. So maybe it's the kitchen that where you grew up, or maybe it is like a log cabin that you visited in the mountains or something like that. But imagery can be quite powerful as well, as can like sipping water, chewing gum, like these things that we only really do when we're feeling relaxed. Like if an antelope is running from a lion in the African like jungle or desert or whatever, they're not going to stop for a snack while they're running from a lion. Like they're only going to stop and eat when they feel safe and that there's no danger. And so doing things that kind of mimic that, like chewing and swallowing, sipping water or chewing gum, that sort of thing can also be useful. And again, there are some of those that are maybe a little bit more covert that you can do if you're feeling threat activation in a more like kind of social or public setting. So.
And then even, there's the sort of physiological change. And then there's also, I think, the emotional recognition of, here I am right now trying something new. Like, it's happening. And so then there's also that process going of just observer, self recognizing, oh, look at me trying something new.
I think that's something that I am always trying to do more of as an RO therapist, is call attention to those things that that signify and represent openness, because that definitely is trying something new, like being open to and willing to practice safety activation. That is a way of practicing openness, and openness is, I suppose, like a word that we use often, radically open, DBT, because being open to trying new things, to thinking differently, these are all things that we want to encourage our over-controlled clients to do, because it is kind of sometimes that more like rigid or closed-minded or fixed-minded, there's another RO word, those are things that they're prone to do because they're hyper threat sensitive, or because they have a sense of there's a right way to do things, but what's happening around them is the wrong thing. That might send them into threat activation. And so what we want to do is teach them more openness, not just because it, is generally a more pleasant and easeful way of moving through the world, but it also is really important for relationships. And when we go back to like social signaling, socially signaling openness is really important for getting other people to like you and want to connect with you. Most people it's going to activate their threat system if they're interacting with someone who they experience is very closed.
Yeah. And it all just kind of, I don't want to say it's full circle, because it's nothing we're doing, in therapy is ever linear, or even just for ourselves is ever linear. But I think it's really, really fascinating and cool that each of these techniques, it's integration. There is interconnectedness. Like each time you're trying one of these different skills, you're also contributing to the other, the other things you're trying to work on. Or, if you think of it as like different parts of you, it's like one part of you, okay, that's what I'm thinking about, but the other parts of me are then getting the chance to change and respond differently too. It's just so cool.
I like it. It's been a paradigm shift for me as a practitioner, as somebody who identifies as over-controlled. It's also super helpful, just anecdotally, been super helpful in my own life. And I think that the paradigm shift in RO is just like how to think about like emotions and behaviors. And before I learned RO, I didn't know what social signaling was. I mean, I suppose I knew it in the sense that like
Right,
you
like
hear
you
about
can,
nonverbal communication
yes.
and things, but like when you talk about like, the concept of like mirror neurons and attachment and all of that, and how we are just like automatically wired to respond to each other's social signaling, then that and you realize that some people have like maybe their social signaling, it doesn't match their values, or it isn't effective to kind of the values or end goals that they have, then it becomes just a very different way of thinking about like therapy and helping people too. That the emotions and the threat, where you are in your body in terms of threat or safety, are very important. But RODBT would probably say that the specific emotion that you're feeling is less important than ultimately what you're conveying. So it's a bit of that like shift from thinking less about like intention and more about impact. So if sometimes in my efforts to manage anxiety and manage my threat sensitivity, I may look more flat or be less engaged in a social interaction. And the impact of that is that other people might experience me as aloof or distant or uninterested. And so when we can instead shift to the kind of primary thing that we want to think about is how am I coming across to others? How am I socially signaling? Then that's just a kind of I think quite a different way of, it becomes much more of a social thing than it does like an internal thing, that and it's very much like I can feel that threat sensitivity, and if I can use social safety to kind of modulate that a little bit, then I might be more able to engage with others in a way that I want to, and ultimately that's kind of what we're going for in RO, is trying to help people change their relationships, because social connectedness is just again and again, more and more we're learning about just how key that is. And I think over the summer or last year sometime, Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General, was like kind of on this like tour where he's talking about the epidemic of loneliness. And fundamentally, that's what a lot of people who struggle with excessive over control struggle with, is feeling lonely, feeling emotionally lonely, not feeling emotionally connected to others. And so when we're able to kind of put the focus on those like social behaviors and social signals, it's like that is the thing that we really want to go for, to help people address that problem.
Well, and it reminds me a little bit of like acceptance and commitment therapy too, in that it's like, okay, if feelings are important, and also if they're leading the way, it's like putting the cart before the horse. Like, and you mentioned values too, and it's this idea of, okay, I'm recognizing and feeling this way. I'm gonna honor it and address it by doing these, my whichever of my things. I'm gonna take a sip of water, and also I'm gonna think about if my values were leading the way here. Like, how might I feel this thing, honor it, address it, and then do it anyway in order to just get closer to this value. And in this case, the value would be social connectedness, which, I agree. I think we're learning more and more as kind of everything. And I think that can be confusing sometimes, to really talk about, of like, what does that mean? How do we put those things together? How do you connect with that value in that moment? Or how do you even know what your values are? I mean, it can be, and I mean, that's what therapy is about, is like finding how you actually have that felt sense of like, I'm I'm finding this balance. I'm ultimately always trying to get closer to a value. But it can be kind of a scary and confusing process sometimes.
Yeah, and I think the other piece is that it can also be kind of invalidating to people to tell them, like, yeah, okay, you feel
Yeah.
like
You feel
upset about this
Yeah.
or anxious or angry or something.
Yes.
And that there are times when that definitely you want to listen to that
Yeah.
emotion. But there are also times when, like I used the example earlier about correcting your friend, and I was actually with a couple friends last night and we were like laughing about this and, like the habit of kind of
Yes.
correcting each other.
Yes.
And there's the sort of like, okay, you do it and you laugh about it.
Yeah.
We're all RO therapists too. So I guess it's like an RO joke or
Yes.
whatever. But I think that it can feel invalidating to people to say, yeah, sometimes you kind of have to like, I guess, eat crow or like where
Yeah.
you're not necessarily like expressing it. Like there might be times when you express it and that's challenging work, but there might also be times when it's a little bit of like feel the fear and do it anyway.
Yeah.
And that can feel invalidating to
Yeah.
people. And I appreciate so many things about RO, and like I said, it's been a bit of a paradigm shift, or not even a bit, a paradigm shift professionally and personally, is that the RO talks about the importance of invalidation, that invalidation is quite important for learning new things. That if I'm never invalidated, appropriately for the things that I
Yeah.
might not be doing, not necessarily correctly, but doing the are serving
helpful.
how
Yeah.
and effective, serving me and are effective, then I'm kind of closed. I'm not open to learning, or I'm kind of closed off. And so I think that's it's also developing the practice of appreciating invalidation and where it is useful and helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love that you said that because I think that's often like a really kind of powerful and beautiful like thing to work through in therapy is like when even the thought process of I should always be validated or I'm always valid. I mean, that can even be sort of fixed in and of itself, or that process of really this doesn't have to be all or nothing. I can still say, all right, I'm aware I'm having this feeling, and I'm aware that, I don't want to create my reasoning based off the feeling or whatever else it might be. So, yeah, I just love that you touched on that because that can be one of those like really cool, things to work through and uncomfortable, right? Like to also totally uncomfortable of. And I think sometimes, you might even say like, yeah, this is uncomfortable. Like this is, there's even a practice of trusting the process and trusting that, again, going back to our discomfort thing, like this is so uncomfortable and it's helpful uncomfortable.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, Katie, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.
Yes, I feel like this is going to be so helpful to so many people that have never heard of RODBT or just that have never been able to put words to the good on paper, but not on, on the inside. Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for, puzzling with me.
I'm not sure I made very much progress. I was really into listening to what you were saying and thinking
goes,
about
little by
RO. But yeah, it's been a pleasure. And I hope that everybody can, find something to take away from our discussion. And I'm excited that you're doing this.
Yay. Thank you.
You're welcome.